Okay.
I request Chip and Marty to come and face the firing squad for a few minutes. Okay. Oh, that's fine, that's fine. Yeah, Marty has to leave, he has a flight to catch in another hour, so
Roz Wilson.
shoot the questions to Chip, sorry, Chip, so shoot the questions to Chip first. Questions to Chip?
We've got
Yes.
Ron.
Yeah, I had one for you, Chip. And it's great to see another rambling wreck here, by the way.
Great.
Welcome to the north. So I saw recently, you talked a little bit about the move from push to pull.
Yes.
And I saw this week that Macy's and Bloomingdale's are now experimenting with same-day delivery from their stores. And I'd just like to know if you had any thoughts on that and its viability, and whether our malls are gonna essentially become sort of like Domino's outlets.
Well, yeah, what's happening is in that particular industry, you sort of have a couple of things are happening at the same time. You have Amazon speeding up delivery by e-commerce, and then you have the Zara. You have Zara also changing the industry in the way they develop their products and how they market their products. And so, you know, the companies that you mentioned are sort of kind of competing with both pressures. One of the advantages that they have is they have bricks and mortar close to the customer, and that bricks and mortar can be more than just outlets for sale. They can be outlets for also essentially serving as many warehouses for e-commerce. So it's an industry that's going through some interesting transformations, both internally from the Zara model and other companies that are following them, as well as the e-commerce sort of Amazon pressure to provide delivery to the home or to somewhere close by very rapidly.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So you mentioned you had drone on your slide. You really talk about it. If Amazon really executes on drone-based delivery, personalized delivery, Budweiser will deliver to the window or something, how do you think it will change the logistics business?
The logistics business is changing. What's happening is you're putting distribution centers closer to urban areas and more distribution centers. So your warehousing, okay, is becoming, instead of DCs 3 or 4 outside of a city, there are a larger number of them a little closer in, so that you can deliver faster, next day service or later in the day kind of service. Now what that does is put your transportation cost on the outbound from the DCs, the distribution centers. It's less expensive, and it's more customer friendly. But on the inbound, it's more expensive because you're delivering to more places. In terms of the inventory, going back to the warehousing, what you have to have is totally more inventory because you can't consolidate your inventory and use the law of large numbers to do risk pooling. So it's significantly changing. Now, you know, we say Amazon is spending probably about 18 to 20% of its cost is in fulfillment now. So they're talking about unsustainable. For ROI. If you didn't have such patient investors, you wouldn't be able to sustain that for a publicly traded company. You were talking about a privately owned company. It's a fairly radical change in terms of the design of the supply chain as a result.
You've got to understand the supply chain is often the basis of a company. For example, Netflix in its original form was basically a logistics company which had disks that it sent around, and its whole model was based on the logistics model itself and not on the product. And this is true with Amazon, this is true with the others. And Amazon, as you said before, is leading the way, so others have to follow in some way. And people think they get free shipping, it's really free, but it's really not free, it's built in elsewhere. But at the end of the day, they've got to make a profit.
And the question that you had is that you not only have Amazon there, but you have Zara leading the way from a different direction. Yeah.
Chip?
Yeah, I know somebody. Oil, fracking oil, being delivered by rail. Is that gonna continue to change? If it continues, what's it gonna do to the rail system in terms of development or improvement of it, or et cetera?
Well, I see that it's having a big impact on intermodal right now, simply because you can't find, you don't have access to rail now. So as a result, instead of, usually the rule of thumb in terms of trucking, if you can truck it under 700 miles, fine. After that, you rail it, unless it's an international move. And what's happening, there's not that much supply rail-wise. So that's the impact. The other impact is the impact on the cost of energy. And all of a sudden, U.S. is very, very well could become a energy exporter. And that changes the equations. You know, as soon as energy gets cheap and you have, for example, interest rates go up, that means longer supply chains, and which is kind of, right now we have reverse globalization. Footprints are moving from Southeast Asia to supplier footprints to, say, Mexico. Mexico is the new China because of some of the risks that you want to mitigate.
Yeah, nearshoring it's called.
Nearshoring, it's often referred to. But if energy gets cheap and interest rates go up, you might see a reverse nearshoring.
There's another thing. One of the sustainable supply chain summits that I chaired, there was a representative from Dow Chemical, and whether it goes to the question of oil or whether it goes to volatile chemicals, they're investing more in pipelines because of the risk associated with moving by rail or by truck. So if we develop shall we say, a sustained oil industry in certain areas, North Dakota, et cetera, and it's accessible, or it could be moved by pipeline as it is from Alaska down to the lower 48, then that is a way that a lot of this will be relieved, and the current rail system will not be burdened as much as it can be. So that's an alternative use in the supply chain.
But right now, it's affecting intermodal.
Yeah.
Okay, let's open now. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question to Dr. Liang. As you explained in your slide, about 15% of energy efficiency can be accomplished by manipulating the vehicle speed, which is about 55 miles per hour. And we know that recently the government or the commercial companies such as 3PL company, they actually suggest or recommend keeping the energy economical vehicle speed, which is around 55 per mile. But because, of course, this is not a strict regulation, I'm just curious how such energy saving initiative is agreed and performed by the real world commercial company in reality.
Well, actually, what happens is governors get set on these diesels, and so they can't go any faster. So it's a pretty hard constraint when you you adjust your governor so the vehicle can't go any faster. So it's pretty good. It's a followed rule, as opposed to hours of service, where the truckload industry, there's a lot of violations of hours of service, and that's actually a problem with the industry and with the sustainability of the industry. And we were talking about risk. I'm starting I should excuse myself. Say thank you very much. It's good to, good. Thank you very much. Good talking. I'll tell Keith that.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the system of system ideas. I think it's pretty interesting. I worked on it several years ago. So I was just wondering how do you see it, where is that now, and whether people find the utility of this perspective.
Well, I think part of the problem is that, there's just not a lot of ubiquity in terms of people understanding the business of systems. The way we educate the engineers that are coming out now, I mean, they get, even at the undergraduate level, they have a fairly specific and tight curriculum. So the idea that they have an appreciation for the nexus of technology and management and the social sciences is really getting lost in a lot of places. And MIT and a few other schools, Stanford, a few others, in the early 90s started pioneering the idea of an engineering systems program. And we're finally getting one started at Penn State here, sometime last spring. So there are a lot of sort of internal institutional barriers in order to be able to do this kind of work. And when you bring people together to have these kinds of discussions, I participated in several different scenario planning workshops. It's very difficult unless you're within a single company. Royal Dutch Shell has been doing this for years. They do it with great success because there's sort of the marching orders within the company and they see where it's going to lead them. We've tried this a couple of times on land use planning and a few other issues, and we're bringing together people from the private sector and the public sector, and it's just really very difficult for them to wrap their heads around the idea of my outputs are your inputs, and if my outputs are my outputs, why should I care about what your inputs are? You're in a different industry. So the whole idea of this coming together is really coming along, but it's really doing it very slowly.
Hey, any other questions? I think everybody's ready for the reception, I guess.
One last one for Marty.
Sure.
So you're extracting a lot of shale gas right here in Pennsylvania. Do you see that changing the shape of the trucking industry? Richard mentioned one carrier in Florida.
Well, we looked at that for the Pennsylvania Turnpike a little while ago in terms of whether they wanted to put compressed natural gas because you can get more, a greater capacity in terms of your mileage using CNG. You compress the gas, it's cryogenic, you put it in the tanks and you can go longer distances, maybe as much as 500 miles. But a lot of what's holding things back now in the industry is there's sort of a chicken and an egg thing. The companies say, we'll buy the trucks as long as there's someplace to fuel. The fuel people say, well, we'll build the fueling facilities as long as there's enough trucks and enough demand. And so it's going to need to be somebody who's sort of like what they call the channel leaders in these sorts of things, somebody like a UPS to say, this is what we're going to do. So for example, in State College, CATA, our local transit authority, went to completely all natural gas buses many years ago, and they've had phenomenal success. Whatever pushback there was initially from the mechanics and other people, it was akin to Cortez burning his ships when he got to the New World. The diesel mechanics, when we went to all natural gas buses, it was learn natural gas or don't have a job, because it wasn't like, well, I'll go work on the diesel buses today because I'm not really comfortable working on those. Now it's happening sort of industry-wide. We're waiting for somebody to sort of drive a stake in the ground and say, this is what we're going to do. The fellow with the prairie grass versus the lawn, and however many years ago his neighbors looked at him and said, what a nut. And then he said, yeah, I saved $900,000, and they say, I always told you that guy was a genius. So we're waiting for the genius to come along and see that. But and I mean, it's just not that simple, too, in terms of the whole production supply chain, again, of going from natural gas to compressed natural gas. There's a lot of sort of processes that need to be gone through in order to get it from out of the ground. And so it's a product that you can actually pump into the saddle tanks on a power unit for a tractor trailer.
The whole thing about fracking and the energy independence that the United States will have, especially in the gas area, will depend upon government policy to a large extent. We're still living with the belief that we are dependent upon foreign oil. And it's a shock to our last 30 or 40 years to believe that now we're now, A, going to be energy independent, B, we are in a position to export. There's laws on the books which restrict export of petroleum products and natural gas from the United States. And this becomes a major issue. I deal a lot in international affairs. Just think of the Ukraine situation and the reluctance of some of the European countries to act against the Russians in regard to certain restrictions and certain limitations on the Russians and sanctions. If the United States announces a program of building natural gas facilities and export facilities and the willingness to supply certain European countries with natural gas over the next 10 years, that would produce a tremendous change in Russian policy. They're dependent now. The only thing that's keeping them from doing what they're doing about cutting off gas to recalcitrant former client states of theirs is the fact that they won't get any money. But that's not, if policy is more important than the money, they'll continue with their policy. But if the European countries believe that they can supply natural gas from those fields in the United States, then they can become truly independent of political pressure. But it'll take activities within DOD, state, and other, shall we say, government agencies in order to change this. Discoveries of natural gas around the world are changing really geopolitical areas. The Israelis are now self-sufficient based upon a big gas find in the Mediterranean. They will be exporting to Southern Europe, where before they were energy dependent upon the rest of the world and it was a choke point for them. They're now going to be exporters of natural gas. So how that changes their geopolitical. Jordan just signed a major deal with the Israelis for to provide Jordan with whoever believes something like that, and that changes a lot of things. So when it comes to natural gas and the shale, it's an amazing phenomenon that happened in the United States.
I mean, there's a port facility right here in Philadelphia that was used for years to import liquefied natural gas. Well, it's, with some alterations, you can send it back out the other way, and they're looking into that, and they've been looking into that for a while, so.
But it's a policy decision. And again, if you can't believe it, we have laws on the books which restrict export of petroleum products from the United States.
Well, and the supply in the US now has pushed the price down so
Exactly.
much that we're gonna need to think about what to do with these markets in order to make a lot of the things related to using that energy source and the associated industries to be able to use that energy source viable.
And from our industry's point of view, think of the logistics fallout, whether it's truck, whether it's pipeline, whether it's rail, and how that affects the other movements of logistics. And somebody was talking about the Macy's thing and Zara and the whole concept of brick and mortar versus cyber purchases. At the end of the day, the product has to be delivered. This is why express companies like UPS, like FedEx, and others are going to do well in this industry as long as they are efficient, because you still have to get the goods. Instead of you driving to the mall, they'll drive to your house. And if they can run a good operation, they're going to be the ones that profit most in regard to cyber sales, as opposed to brick and
But
mortar.
you can sort of even tie this thing back to the system of systems questions from the standpoint of the paradigm is changing. I mean, compare where we are in the logistics business to where we were 20 years ago. Think about 20 years into the future. The first packageless supermarket opened in Berlin on Sunday. You go in with your own containers. You go in with any liquids are there are prepackaged, but they're all return bottles and those sorts of things. No packaging. How does this stuff come to that market? Well, it's got to be packaged at some point. You don't load a tractor trailer full of cereal and take it out with shovels, okay? But it's not going to come in cereal boxes anymore, okay? So how does that change things around? What happens when Uber goes from picking up and dropping off people to picking up and dropping off packages? So, you know, we can't even, I think, comprehend yet of what these changes are going to be, but we need to have sort of facile minds and the agility to be able to respond to these changes just as quickly as they're happening.
Uber would change its name to UPS. Uber package services.
That's right. They'll just do it themselves, as a question. And then you have regulatory issues that are associated with that, and like your diesel guys, there'll be likely taxi unions are keeping Uber from happening, and there'll be attempts to keep it from happening, but it's going to happen because the marketplace requires this all to happen.
Biggest barrier probably on any of this stuff is almost always going to be institutional.
Yeah, it is.
Right now, Uber's running into an insurance problem.
But how many
What happens?
how many buggy whip manufacturers do we have now?
Exactly.
Exactly.
All right, let me give you an appreciation for your.
Oh, why? My name is on it. Oh, my God.
Yes.
Is that chocolate or is that?
It's all described as Marty.
Very nice, thank you.
Appreciate it.
This is lovely. Thank
So,
you.